Welcome back to Count Me In. I'm Adam Larson, and today I'm excited to host Howard Chang, CEO of Just Meeting Rooms. Howard is not only a seasoned entrepreneur, but also a survivor of both personal and professional trials. In this episode, he shares his journey through bankruptcy, battling cancer, highlighting the critical importance of resilience, learning from failure, and effective cash flow management. Join us for an inspiring conversation filled with Howard's invaluable insights and seasoned wisdom on navigating the challenging waters of entrepreneurship and life. Well, Howard, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to have you here. And today we're going to be focusing on just lessons from somebody like you who is an entrepreneur who's had ups and downs, successes. And, any entrepreneur probably has those similar stories. And one of those things that's inevitable when it comes to starting businesses and any journey that you have is failure. So maybe we can start with how do you define failure and what's your perspective and how it changed you as you went throughout your journey?
Well, I think failure is only real if you fail to learn from a mistake and try to evolve and get better from it. I think we all fail, with a small f, meaning we make mistakes all the time. But are you willing to kind of pick yourself up and move ahead? I think a true failure is walking away from making a mistake in some way and not learning, deciding that you just going to turn your back and do the same old thing all over again. I mean, that to me would be a failure. I had a bankruptcy at 29, and that was a really soul-searching moment for me where I had to decide, do I pick myself back up and try to start another business? Do I try to get a job? I've never held a job at that point. I only had my own business. Do I go drive a cab? What were my options? I was bankrupt, destitute, in single dad with 2 kids in my parents' basement at 29. I was a sad sack, to be honest with you, at that moment. But you know what? I decided to, hit the public library. It was in the 90s, long before the internet kind of, gave us, all that information at the fingertips. And I hit the public library and I started reading about business, and I started reading about marketing, and I started reading about all these things. So I think, yes, I failed in a sense that I had a bankruptcy. I lost my house and my wife left me and all that stuff. But I turned that into a really important lesson in life. And I think that is probably the most valuable gift that's ever actually happened to me as a business person.
That is an amazing gift, to watching yourself get back up from that, especially looking back upon it. And picking yourself up from something like that is very difficult. What helped you stay motivated to keep going? Because I can imagine it's not an easy task picking yourself up from something like a bankruptcy you're just explaining.
Oh man, I was depressed. I'm literally at 25. So I made my first million at 23. By 25, I was driving a brand new Porsche. I had a beautiful house on the water in Toronto. I had 2 kids, married. I was living the life. And at 29, I'm like single dad in my parents' basement, total loser. So I was having depression issues. I was, doubts about my own self-worth. I had one of my own family members just say, "Hey, give up, just drive a cab. You're never going to pull yourself back up from this. This was too big of a fall." Right.
Yeah.
And so you're dealing with all of that stuff. So I think for me, one of the biggest gifts that my parents gave me when I was young is they really encouraged me to get into sport. So I did lots of sports as a kid. I started martial arts when I was 9. I studied judo. We spent about a year in Japan. My dad was a economic commissioner in Japan for about a year. He was sent over by the Ontario government here in Canada. So I learned judo, and judo in Japan is like a hard knocks judo, right? This is not judo in Canada. You got beaten when you didn't do your technique right. But what that taught me, that journey through martial arts and sport, it taught me resilience. I think any business person, any person, I would say, resilience is probably our best quality, to be able to survive a moment and move beyond it and get stronger. So I kind of tapped into some of those resources that I had in sport where, I crashed when I raced bicycles. I had my shoulder dislocated multiple times in judo tournaments, but I always came back from those. So I used some of that thinking and kind of reminding myself, I've done it before. I can do it again. I think giving yourself that context and that moment to really take a breath and remember that you can actually do this. We need these reminders all the time, right? Because in the moment, we can get very tunnel vision and fall into that spiral of depression and self-doubt. And also have some good peers around you. Yes, I had some detractors, but I also had some cheerleaders. That really helps as well.
It really does help because you can't get up to the top of a mountain by yourself.
No.
You need people helping you. You need tools. And something that came to my head as you were talking, I thought of, how in a lot of times in organizations, people silo themselves and they don't connect. But a lot of times we silo our experiences and we forget that your experience in sport can be applied to your business. And it's like you have to break what did you have to do to break down those silos and your experience to apply it?
Well, I think one of the things, I had a bit of time on my hands when I went bankrupt, right? So I started getting back into sport. I started riding my bike again. I started doing some inline skating. I got back into martial arts again. I started teaching judo again. And so I think moving the body is really important. So I think there's an old Chinese saying that says, experience without reflection is foolish, but reflection without experience is dangerous. So if I just sat there and just gazed at my navel for months, I probably would have spiraled really heavily.
Yeah.
But you know what? Instead, I decided to move my body, get into the world, connect with people, keep moving forward. And combining that with some self-reflection, I think put me in a healthier place. I think we don't want to just move forward without, thinking about the lessons we've learned, but we can't just think too. We need to think and act together in order to find that balance, which makes us productive. I think ultimately, I'm a fairly straightforward person. Like I want to be productive in this life. So whether that's the philanthropy I do or the businesses I run or the dad, I'm actually a granddad now. I like to think a really young granddad, a young hip granddad. But anyways, I'll let my granddaughter judge that. But, I think that that idea of how do we remain productive is a combination of thought and action together, which makes us productive.
Yeah. So what about your support system? That's very crucial. What did you do as you were kind of starting your new businesses after you came back from that bankruptcy? How did you build that support system, that network to kind of help you get through?
Well, I think part of the reason why I went bankrupt in my 20s is I thought I was the smartest kid in the room, and I obviously wasn't. In the 80s, bank financing was in and around 17%. I know some of your younger listeners are going, what? What do you mean? You mean 7%? No. There's a teen there. 17% was bank financing back in the 80s. And so trying to, grow a business, I grew a multi-million-dollar retail chain using bank financing, which apparently was too costly. So I didn't listen to enough advice. One of the people that I really listened to in my 30s was my dad. My dad was super smart, but being a belligerent, arrogant little jerk in my 20s, I didn't listen to my dad. And in the 90s, he gave me some amazing advice. He told me to buy an Apple computer, invest in Apple stocks. He started pushing me towards technology, build yourself a website. And I started listening to him, and he was really, really wise. He was an economist. That was his training. And I thought, like, literally I have an economist as my dad, and I didn't listen to him about business. Like, what a dork. But anyways, I finally started listening to him, and I started also talking to other people in my life that were successful. I asked for their advice. I learned a bit of humility, essentially. That really helped me a lot. But I think, something that I think we all hear, it takes a village, right? I don't think there's any such thing as a self-made person. We bring people around us and they help lift us up to some level of success. I have 60 employees now. I mean, I can't do what I do without my staff. They're incredible. They lift me up. I might give them some leadership and guidance, but they're doing the heavy lifting. So I do think surrounding yourself with the right people is huge.
It is huge because as they raise you up, those people get lifted up too, and they can become successful as they learn from their own journey. So it's a win-win situation.
Definitely. I mentor some young entrepreneurs now. Yeah. So my company, the Turn Lab, we're a marketing technology company, but we're also an incubator. We actually incubate startups, and we've done it for ourselves as well as others. So I do mentor some young leaders, and you know what? I learn as much from them as they do from me. I'm always learning something new when I chat with some of these young leaders. And I think leaning in, listening, and really actively listening to the people you engage with is kind of a superpower for successful entrepreneurs. I find most really successful entrepreneurs very curious. We have a saying at the Turn Lab is our job isn't to sell solutions. Our job is to fall in love with the problem. And I think that philosophy has helped us gain a lot of traction in the marketplace because we're not trying to sell someone a website or a marketing program. We're trying to deeply understand what are the gaps that they're facing between, let's say, themselves or their audience or the customer experience. And by deeply understanding that and using research, intelligence, and evidence, we actually then create beautiful bespoke solutions, that's not necessarily a packaged solution, but it actually is something that solves a problem. I think as we face anything in life, let's first all start with falling in love with the problem. Like I think about even relationships. If I think about some of the conversations I have with my wife is, I'd probably do a lot better if I just asked her more questions, right? As opposed to mansplaining something to her, right? Like just ask more questions, learn more. And then that way you can get some insights into, okay, what is actually upsetting her about me not cleaning the sink in the bathroom on a regular basis? Okay, I get it. Now I understand. And therefore, when I connect my actions, I know that this is something that she actually cares about. So I do think curiosity and really interested in the problem is better than, coming at it like I'm the smartest guy and I've got the solution.
Well, I think all of us can understand what it feels like. If you've been in your 30s or gone through your 30s, I think all of us get a little humble in our 30s as gravity takes over and life hits us and kids get older and all those different things kind of hit us. But I love what you said about, falling in love with a problem and being curious. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that, because that's something that I feel like all of us can learn from in our lives, but also in jobs, because a lot of times you're presented with this and you get you get presented with the project at work. Let's say you're not a leader. Let's say you're just you get presented with the projects, and you focus on the solution. But from what I'm hearing you saying, if you focus more on if you fall in love with the problem and delve into what the problem is, the solution presents itself.
Well, I know your audience has some finance professionals, and I would say that, finance professionals in general are actually probably better at this than most. Most financial professionals are fairly interested in the problem. They're fairly interested in what exactly is going on here. Why is this G&A where it's at right now? Why is our labor percentage so high? I think a lot of my finance leaders in my company, they're constantly raising issues with me, problems we need to solve. So I think that's a really good thing. I don't think enough people in positions of management or authority have the same philosophy, unfortunately. They lead more through force of will as opposed to really deeply understanding, what are their teams and their clients actually facing? So I do think that idea of curiosity is great, but then disciplining that into practice is really important, right? So, there's I'm curious about the finances, and then there's forensic accounting, right? So there's kind of a difference between the two, right? And so what we try to do in our consultancy, we go in and we have very specific tools that we use to fall in love with the problem. Like for instance, we host a 10,000 member consumer panel that we regularly survey. We run focus groups. We run surveys. We have our analysts on staff. We have strategists on staff, market research. So that we invest in falling in love with the problem. It's just not, a bunch of schmoes sitting around asking questions. Like it's an actual process.
I like that it's an actual process, because when I think about it, you can be Curious George, the monkey, getting your hands in everything and breaking everything, or you can be curious enough to, there's another side of that, not the extremes like forensic accounting, to just being, it takes data, it takes discipline. A lot of the things that you were talking about, you learned from sport. It takes that drive, and that you may stumble a few times, you may fall off your bike and dislocate your shoulder, but do you let that stop you from ever riding it again? No.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, if I think back to the pandemic, like there were a lot of problems to solve, by the way, in the middle of the pandemic. But one of the ones that we saw that was really growing and still an issue right now is sort of a growing collaboration deficit amongst knowledge workers. So with remote and hybrid work, you and I are talking through essentially Zoom right now, but it's very hard to make deeper human connections through the little pinhole of a video conference or a phone call. And so we knew this collaboration deficit was impacting people's mental health. We also knew it was impacting innovation, creativity, and Microsoft did this massive study where it was actually impacting product quality. So I think, when we were looking at those problems, we go, well, how do we solve a collaboration deficit? So we actually launched a startup not even a year ago, last March, called Just Boardrooms. So justboardrooms.com. Check it out. It's a very easy platform to use. It's like an Airbnb of professional meeting spaces. Because really what we wanted to do was create a really easy, frictionless way for people to come together in person for moments that matter. I agree We don't all need to be in the office 5 days a week anymore. But there are moments that matter. There are times when we have to come together to build a solution, to innovate and to collaborate, or to pitch a big client. Harvard Business Review did a study that showed that you're 10 times more likely to close a business deal in person than over the phone or on a video conference call. So there are moments that matter. So Just Boardrooms, really, it's a very simple idea. We don't own anything. We're just a marketplace, right? We have hosts, like we have co-working spaces. We have professional office. We actually have law firms and accounting firms that put their boardrooms on our platform. The way they look at it is, well, everybody needs an accountant. Why wouldn't we put our platform on, have business people come in here? So anyways, we have all these hosts. We have about 270 so far. We just launched it. We're in 50 markets in US and Canada. And then we have users. So the users are like gig work, like freelancers, consultants. Could be someone like you, Adam, that you may not have a corporate office, but you need an office. You need a place to meet someone once in a while. Coffee shop isn't really cutting it these days for, important business meetings. And it's just really putting people together, sharing economy, right? Like that's really what it's about. So that was a problem that we saw. So we're building the solution now, and we're constantly researching, iterating, and we're polling our users, and we're looking at the data. And so we don't think a problem is one problem. It's constantly looking at the business and seeing how can we. I think there's a Japanese term called Kaizen. I think Toyota kind of used it a lot when they're developing this idea of continuous improvement. I think that's another piece, right? We're not just solving a problem, but how do we continuously improve? How do we constantly iterate so that we keep getting better? I think those are things that I've learned in business, is that there's no stop and go. You got to just keep moving forward at a pace that makes sense for you and your partners.
That does make a lot of sense, because the importance, I've been in organizations that applied the Kaizen method, the Six Sigma, that continuous improvement people.
Yeah.
And working with those folks can be pretty intense, because you're like, wait, we have to look at this process and look at that process. And that it can be overwhelming at first, but once you kind of get into it, you realize how important it is. But I think the problem with sometimes with some of those processes is they'll bring somebody in who's that expert. Here's what you need to do, and that person goes away.
Yeah.
But then you never look at the process again. So how do you build that? How do you build that kind of that mentality of that continuous improvement all the time? You don't have to bring an expert consultant in and that person leaves and you never do it again.
Well, I think the most important attitude to have is don't let perfection be the enemy of productivity, right? So the biggest problem, I think, with the Kaizen idea is this idea. Some people interpret it as a path to perfection. There is no perfection, right? If you think of it as just incremental improvements, that way you're not constantly, flipping from 90 degrees to 180 degrees to 100. Like, it's small incremental. Like the idea of Kaizen, the general philosophy of Kaizen, because Japanese are pretty conservative to begin with in terms of how they make decisions. It's all about small incremental changes that leads to a much better outcome over time. So that's why I talked about the pace of your organization, the pace of your stakeholders, because what most leaders fail to do is they fail to take into consideration the pace of their stakeholders. Most leaders can go from 0 to 100 really fast, but then they leave about 80% of their team behind, right? We want to go forward. We want to create better things, but we don't want to leave dead bodies behind, right? So incremental change. Let's get it to 70% and then we keep moving. We don't need to get it to 100%. I think really understanding that is important, because otherwise you'll constantly feel like you're failing. Oh, we try to make an improvement, but it wasn't perfect, so we failed. No. It's good enough. And we can keep moving forward. That's one of the key lessons I've learned.
I wish we had had this conversation when I was in my 20s, because I feel like it would have really helped me have a better view on business and how I should go through life. Because it's one of those things where you see something, you're like, that's really cool, I want to do that. But you don't take the time to look into it, develop it, see how it applies to you. And I think that's why rushing into things can be very dangerous, especially as an entrepreneur, and especially when you're taking different gambles and risks in business.
Listen, life is risky, right? We could step off a curb and get smacked by a bus. But you know what? Carpenters are smart. Measure twice, cut once, right? Like, I think it's really important to, spend a little bit of time understanding something before we jump in. But, it's okay to jump in sometimes a little bit ahead and learn a lesson from that too. Life is not linear, right? Life can be quite convoluted. And I've learned lessons in a lot of different ways, including being slapped right in the face by life. So yeah, it all remains positive if we make it so, essentially.
Yeah. So, talk a little bit about risk, especially in your entrepreneurial journey. When do you make that decision to take that calculated risk, or when do you sometimes you find out that calculated risk could become a reckless gamble? Like, how do you find that balance?
I think after bankruptcy, one of the things that I really focused on was really mitigating risk. So as an entrepreneur,
Mm-hmm.
you have to make risks and, calculate it. Yeah, you can calculate all you want, but what's your backup plan? That's, I jokingly tell people the secret to my success is cash flow management. And they go, what? What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
I go, yeah, because, for a small company, what often sends that company into deep trouble and sometimes into chapter 11 is bad cash flow management. So you can be actually making a profit, but if you don't have, X number of months of operating capital, if you don't have the ability to access cash, either through credit or through, savings or whatever to fund growth can be really dangerous, right? So if you look at my company, one of my companies, the Turn Lab, we are essentially a professional services company. So if I landed a big client tomorrow, that's a $1 million contract. That's incredible. I've got to hire about 8 to 9 people. I may not see the first payment for 90 days.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's just how it works, right? By the time you sign the contract, you're building the teams, you're hiring people, you're ramping up. Now I'm like a couple of $100,000 in cash that I've laid out for all these teams, software I had to buy, computers I had to buy. I haven't seen one check from this client yet. Contract signed. Now I'm in a cash crunch. Now I can't make payroll. Now I start getting stressed out. So you can be profitable. You can land that big client, but if you don't have the essentially the financial planning and strength to manage those cash flow issues, growth can be actually extremely dangerous.
And I'm sure our listeners love hearing you say that because I'm sure they've had many fights with bosses, with people that they've connected with, or organizations they've worked for, and the importance of that cash flow management. Because if you don't have good cash, you don't have good organization of your finances, things can go crazy very quickly.
Yeah, I find it really bizarre when I hear leaders talk about EBITDA all the time, which is great. I mean, you got to make a profit, but the day-to-day management of your financial resources is actually way more critical to success. And I certainly, my business that went bankrupt, we weren't losing money, actually. We were just managing cash so badly that we were struggling to make our bank payments for our line of credit. And that's why the bank called the line. The bank didn't call the line because we weren't making money. The bank was calling the line because we weren't making our interest payments, right? We were managing our cash balance. We had all this inventory. We didn't have enough cash. And they put us into Chapter 11 because of bad cash flow management. So that's just an example. And we were growing. I was growing this into a multi-million-dollar company. Like, on paper, it looks like I was doing all the right things, but apparently not. So that was one of the big lessons I learned in my 20s. Luckily, I got that one out of the way because I haven't had that issue since.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, you don't want to do that a lot. It's a lot harder to come back from that later, I'm sure.
Definitely.
So, you've been through a lot of battles. I'll call them battles because a lot of times in life, we it's not really fighting, but it feels like fighting the way it physically drains our bodies. And maybe we could talk about some of the scars you've received. You've kind of mentioned some of them. How have you turned those scars, those failures into kind of like badges of honor and things that help inspire others?
Yeah, I think, wisdom is that accumulation of experience and battle scars. I mean, there's absolutely battle scars. I mean, to this day, I'll remember certain things that I've done or happened to me, and it literally just gives me the shivers. I'm like, oh my God, that was so horrible. So even to this day, some of those scars remain, but that's okay. They're kind of tacit reminders, like not to do them again. I will say though that, I've had a few lessons around, the people that I've brought into my world, whether they were an employee, a partner, investor, client, that didn't necessarily work out very well. But each time I've tried to, take a lesson, learn from that. I've been fired by clients. I've had to fire some clients. I've had to lay off lots of people when a big piece of business went away. I've had to do all kinds of things that, even to this day, I'm like, God, I wish I didn't have to do those things. But that's how business happens, unfortunately. It's not a linear, it's like this staggered kind of jagged growth to success. I'm definitely, successful now. I own a bunch of companies. I have a beautiful home on the water. I've got a beautiful place in the Bahamas. By any measure, I would say I'm successful. But it's taken a long road to get to where I am and a lot of lessons along the way. And I think the other thing that I think really impacted was my cancer diagnosis in 2017. So I was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 2017. I'm thinking, God, I live this healthy lifestyle. I eat like mostly a plant-based diet. I eat organic. Like what the heck could be causing cancer? But, again, I fell in love with the problem. I started doing tons of research. I started talking to all kinds of experts, but not just in Canada, in the US and the UK and Germany. And I really wanted to kind of take control of my own health. So that crisis became also a bit of an opportunity for me to kind of like rethink my health. So I ended up getting surgery in Germany because they had the most advanced therapy. It's called IRE nanoknife. I suggest anybody who knows anybody who's suffering from prostate cancer or has been diagnosed with it, check out nanoknife. It was actually invented in Albany, New York. Actually,
Oh,
yeah, it's an American invention, and what it is, it's a focal therapy that ablates the tumor in your prostate without damaging tissue around it. So the biggest challenge with prostate surgery is that there's tons of nerve damage, right? A lot of men end up incontinent, erectile dysfunction, all kinds of issues. So I went and did this very advanced surgery in Germany, and through that whole process, yeah, it sucked. Cancer sucks. My cancer was fairly advanced. I was wondering, like, am I going to have the intestinal fortitude to get through all of this? Did I get depressed? Absolutely. Did I consider like ending it all at one point? A little bit. I thought about it for a little bit because I had so many friends that went through cancer. It was such a shit show for them that I'm like, oh my God, like, I don't know whether I'm up for this. So that was again, another moment in life where I had to kind of reset everything I knew about myself. And then out of that, I have some literal scars from that. I literally have physical scars from the surgery, but my mental scars, I would say, have made me stronger. I would say the journey through cancer has definitely made me stronger. And then 2 years ago, I had a reoccurrence. So it came back. So then I dealt with that now, and I'm again cancer free. So it's I think life just keeps throwing wrenches at you because I think, I'm not a religious person, but I'm also not stupid enough to feel like I know everything about, I wouldn't call myself an atheist per se. There's probably forces in the universe I absolutely don't understand. But sometimes I think the universe just throws shit at us because they believe that we can handle it. And it's a way for us to learn and grow. So that's how I've kind of treated it, as kind of like a life lesson. So scars are good. I don't really want one across my face necessarily, but I'll take a few in my psyche because it's helped me learn.
It does help you learn. And I really appreciate you being vulnerable to share that story because I know it may not be easy for everybody to share that type of a story, but you've learned so much from it and grown from it. You're stronger because of it. And that just makes us better people in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, we're all flawed in some way, right? I mean, it's, one of my business partners here is actually my daughter. She's one of the co-founders of the Turn Lab, and she's a fabulous executive in her own right. But a couple of years working together, she was very frustrated. And she said to me, "You don't have a work mask, do you?" And I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "You're exactly at work as you are at home. Like you don't have a work mask." And she goes, "I don't know how to deal with that." And I go, I guess I've always been that way because I've always run my own business, right? I've never really felt like I had to perform for an audience because I always felt like I just had to be who I am. I need to bring who I am to the table. And I think when we talk about things like authenticity, I think, meta talk aside, is just be yourself, treat your audience, your stakeholders with respect. And I think I've learned that over the years. I try to behave in that way with everyone around me. So whether they're, my clients or my staff, but I think that's also was really exemplified through some of these tough lessons like cancer, which is, hey, we're all going to die. That's the great equalizer here, right? Like no one's getting out of this alive.
Yeah.
Right. So when you remember that, you kind of go, yeah, it's okay to just be yourself, right? Just treat people with respect. If in doubt, be nice. If in doubt, be generous. I always tell people my path to success has been more about what I gave than what I got. If you're constantly willing to lean in, you're constantly willing to help out, it all comes around. The people in your life recognize that and they want to help you in return. So I really do think that, these battle scars, lessons, etc., more than anything, they've just taught me humility. And I think humility brings you closer to your authentic self.
Well, Howard, I I think we could talk about these things for a long time, but I just really appreciate you coming on the podcast, sharing your story with our audience. I've been inspired, and I hope they're inspired as well to be their authentic selves and do great things.
Thank you very much.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.